So for this tutorial, what we're going to do is kind of bring everything together and wrap up this section. I want to do a highly complex animation, and from the example you can see before you, we're easing the animation in, rotating it, and changing the opacity all at the same time. This is a pretty complex animation, and in other frameworks and other languages, you'd be writing this code for weeks. Flutter, though, it's dead simple. We're going to actually just completely blow away the code I have running in the background and retype it line by line, and we'll go through the whole thing. So let's take this down, stop this, switch over to my live template here, which is just the skeleton that we've been starting with. And if we run this again, you'll see in the emulator, it's just the plain Jane application that we've come to know and love. Might take just a second for that to build up. So while we're waiting on this, some of the key concepts that we're really going to cover are going to be opacity, rotations, and size, which are all tweens. Remember, a tween just simply stands for in between. So let's go ahead and import the animation package. Now, of course, we need our ticker provider state mixin. Now that we've got our import and our mixin, we can actually get down to business here. So what we need to start with is, well, you guessed it, we need to set up some tweens. So let's go in here and let's make our there's our animation, and let's make our animation controller. And we're going to follow pretty much the same design pattern that we've been following here. So some of this may just look like we've typed it before because we have. So we're going to knit state, and then we're going to say controller. We want a new animation controller, and we're going to vsync this. Set our duration. And in our duration, let's go ahead and set this to milliseconds. And we want this to go fairly quickly, so we're going to say the entire animation is only going to last 2000 milliseconds, or 2 seconds. That way it gives the impression that it's moving fairly quickly. We're going to say animation equal new curved animation. Our parent is going to be the controller, and our curve is the trusty old curve ease in. That's how we get that thing coming right at us. Now we want to add a listener because we want this to go forward and backwards, so we need to go void we want animation status. And we're going to say if status equals animation status completed. We're going to reverse that. Otherwise, if it's been dismissed, then we want to move forward. Jump back up into our init state. We're going to add listener, and then we're going to start our animation. So far, everything's pretty much the same as it was. We've only really changed the milliseconds. This is where we're going to start deviating from that. What we're going to do next is we're going to make a class called Animated Logo, and then we're going to set the child in the container. And you'll see exactly what's going on here. So let's jump up here. And we're going to say Animated Widget. This is how you would create your own widget and then animate it. You notice how it's already complaining because we're missing some stuff. Missing concrete implementation of animated widget.build. There's your animated builder. There we go. So let's go ahead and implement that now. And we want the build context. We've now satisfied the requirements. Everything else in here is just, kind of fluff. Whatever we want to put in here, we can do. Point is, because this is an animated widget, we can turn anything, any widget, into an animated widget. We're going to make some tweens here. And we're going to make them static because they don't change. And we're going to make this a double. And let's say we want to go from 0.1 and end at 1.0. That's our opacity. And because we're going to be working with doubles, we can pretty much just grab this whole thing. And through the magic of copy and paste, just throw a couple in there. Change our size. Let's say the size is going to go from 00 to 300. And then we want our rotation. Actually, let's call it rotate tween. And this is going to go from 00 to 12. Let's throw in a constructor here. So we're going to say animated logo. We'll say key. And then we want an animation that is typed as a double because we're going to be working with doubles. And we're just simply going to call this, animation. And we're going to say key is the key. And then we want to just hand it a listenable item. There we go. So if you're really looking at this, what we got here is just a simple class that is extending the animated widget. And then we've got some tweens in here. We've got our constructor, which just has a key and then an animation. And then we're just, using the super to say listenable is the animation and the key. Now we need to flesh out this builder. This is where the magic of most of this is going to happen here. So we'll say final, animation double, and we want this to be our listenable. There we go. Now, because this is a builder, we need to actually return something. So we're going to return a new center. And then, of course, we need to flesh out our widget tree here. So we'll say child, and we want this to be a new transform. Got a little ahead of myself there. We want a transform rotate. And the angle, of course, is going to be the rotate tween, and we want to evaluate that. What evaluate does is it actually says where are we in the current tween, and evaluate says, okay, out of the entire tween and given the state of the controller, where are we currently at, and then grab that specific value. And we're going to get that out of the animation. And let's actually do this. Drop this down. Child equal new opacity. And notice how the first thing it wants is the actual opacity itself. So let's bump this down to a new line just so we don't get too confused here. Actually, let's leave that. We'll put the child on the new line. And we're going to say, we're going to evaluate that based off the animation. We're going to add another child. And this one is actually going to be a container. All right, now, this is looking pretty horrible. We've got a lot of code here. I'm trying to keep it nice and simple so you can see what's going on, but you can see how this line right here is kind of ugly. That's going to be kind of typical with your Dart Flutter code, so just try to do your breaks whenever possible so you can understand it when you look at it. So we've got our container. Inside of our container, we're going to say a margin, and we want a new edge inset all, and let's do symmetrical actually instead of all here. There we go. So now we've got a symmetrical, and we're going to do the vertical as 10.0. Now we want the height, and we want that to be the size tween. And you guessed it, we're going to evaluate that animation and the width. And we're going to evaluate that off the animation. Now remember, whenever you see evaluate, think of that as you're looking at the tween, the sequence of numbers, and you're trying to figure out where you are based at that given time. So this really becomes a template for an animation. Anytime you see evaluate, it says plug in the current number. So every time that animation controller fires off, there's a timer in there internally, it's going to use this template and just plug in these numbers every time you see evaluate. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, so we've got our center and everything else. We are only missing one thing here, which is the child. We need something to actually show or visualize the animation. And there is our Flutter logo. We've got our listener, we've got our init state. Now we need to go down here into our build context here. And we're going to actually simplify this code quite a bit. So here's our container, and let's grab this right here. We don't even need the center, so we're going to grab that. And we're going to say new animated logo, animation. So what we're doing here is we're actually taking the body of our widget, of our state I should say, shrinking it down and then moving all of the animation components over into its own class, which we could actually put into its own file. And that would be an ideal way of templating your widgets so that you can animate them. Let's actually run this, pull up our emulator here, and as you can see, it's working as expected. So in about 10 minutes or less, you can build a fairly complex animation in Flutter, and it looks just stunningly beautiful, even on an emulator.